Well, good evening. It is good to see you all this evening. One of these days, I'm just going to say as we start out here, I'm going to invite us all to join in a game of Red Rover. We're going to have this side of the building versus this side of the building. It's going to be really entertaining. It's going to be quite a mismatch. We are continuing our series on tactics. And before we get into tonight's lesson, I want to throw something out there now. You don't have to answer right now, but I just kind of want to get a feel. So if you have the book, and if you've been reading through the book, you probably noticed it's divided into kind of two parts. We're about to finish the first part. We've been working on this for, a few months now, something like that. We're about to finish that first section. The second section is going to go into some more tactics, kind of go more in depth, go into some different things, and I think that would all be valuable for us. I haven't finished reading that section yet, but as we have been going through, I would love some feedback on what y'all want to do, because I understand that some of this can, we can get, I don't know, what am I saying here? We can kind of get to a point where maybe it's like, okay, this is a lot of information. I need time just to digest this and kind of come back. So what I'm saying is I'm trying to figure out if we want to move into part 2 immediately after part 1, or if we want to maybe take a break from tactics and do something else on Sunday nights, another subject for a little while. So I would love some feedback on that. If you're kind of like, okay, I'm really enjoying this, let's keep on going and digging deeper. If you're like, this has been a lot and I want to try and have some time to kind of put it into practice and so forth, and then move on to other tactics later so I'm not overwhelmed with everything at once. So I would love feedback on that. Like I said, talk to me afterward, whatever. But I'm just kind of, as we're over the next few weeks going to wind up that first section, I'd love to kind of see what y'all want to do. A couple weeks ago, I know it's been that now. Well, come on, there we go. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the first part of our third Columbo tactic. This is the idea of, we'll talk about the idea of it in a minute, but essentially the idea of making a point. And we talked in large part in that about the idea that a lot of times, especially what we find out with our first two questions, people have a lot of the pieces of the puzzle already, if you will. There's already a lot of things that they have in front of them, they just haven't made the connections they need to make. For example, we talked about a conversation between a young woman and the author where the young woman was asking essentially, well, what about all these other religions? Can't they, be sincere and still be right with God? And he said, okay, well, you believe that, as a Christian, you believe that Jesus died to save us from our sins, right? Well, yes. And you believe that sin is, for lack of a better term, a disease that's going to kill us all if we don't take care of it, right? Well, yes. Well, Jesus is the one who saves us from sin, and without Jesus, sin's going to kill us all. Can you be saved without Jesus? And she's like, well, I hadn't thought of it that way. And we might think, well, how could you not? Well, people a lot of times just don't make the connections that might seem obvious to us. That's just the way it is. So a lot of this question is about putting those pieces together. So we're going to continue tonight with part 2. And what I really want to do in this in particular is I want us to now take everything that we've been learning and begin to try and kind of put it into practice a little bit. We're going to take some scenarios and we're going to work them together. We're going to try and kind of create something that we can just kind of work through the process in our own minds. Before we do that, I want to remind us, though, of what Columbo 3 is. It's not a specific question like the other two. Remember, question number 1 is, what do you mean by that? Question number 2 is, how did you come to that conclusion? Question number 3, rather than being a specific question, I'm going to take the answers I got from 1 and 2, and I'm going to create some sort of a leading question. For example, I'm confused because you said this and this, but then you said this. I don't understand how those two things work together. That would be exposing a flaw in the argument. Or, would you agree that such and such is the case if, based on what you said, blah, blah, blah. Again, we're talking about specific scenarios in just a second. But the idea is I'm creating another question, always questions, but I'm creating another question this time to really try to make a point, to really try and lead them to an idea. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but in the latter part of this chapter, and I don't believe we talked about this last time, he has this conversation with someone who basically brings up something along the lines of the conflict between Judaism and Christianity. And he's talking about, well, why can't we all get along, kind of a vibe, if I understand correctly. And the author, he basically is like, well, let me ask you something. do you believe that people who do wrong should be punished? And the man says, well, my job, my career, I am a prosecuting attorney, so I guess I kind of do believe that people who do wrong should be punished. And the author's like, yes, that works in really well, right? He didn't know the author's occupation at first, or the man's occupation at first. And so he asks him, he says, okay, well, have you done anything wrong in your life? And just quite frankly, and the man says, well, yes. And the author says, me too. But we both agree that if you've done something wrong in your life, you need to be punished. I call that bad news for both of us, right? You see what he's done. Again, he's asking questions based on what he's gathered to then create an issue, and then we go back to what we talked about with that young lady that he had the conversation with. Okay, well, if we have a problem, evil needs to be punished, well, then I need to be punished. But the only way that I can avoid that punishment is for someone to save me. So, again, we're kind of using those things. But I want us to, we're going to take 3 for now and kind of see where that goes. But we'll start with the first one. Basically, here's kind of what we want to do tonight. We're really trying to make this a very practical experience for us. So, essentially, we're going to try this and see if it flows the way that I want it to. And if it doesn't, it's on me because I'm trying to design it in a helpful way. I'm going to essentially be playing devil's advocate, okay? I will kind of help us along as well, but basically, I'm going to have y'all use your tactics, and we can do it all at once. It doesn't have to be, like just one person or anything like that. I'm going to have y'all use your tactics given a specific statement, and then I'm going to try, every time you ask a question, I'm going to try and answer a question as if we're having this conversation. And we're going to kind of see different directions that a conversation could go when we're using our tactics. Now, that may not make sense yet, so let's try one. I think it'll make sense as we go along. So, we're going to start with this scenario. You and I are having a conversation, and I don't believe in Christianity maybe, or don't believe in this or that. Well, maybe you don't know exactly what I believe, but you say something about the Bible. Maybe you just mentioned something about, I was reading a passage in my Bible today, and then the mailman came, or something. I don't know, just something random. You just happen to mention the Bible. And I say, well, I've never really read much of the Bible. To me, the Bible is just like any other ancient book, right? It's a masterpiece, I'm sure. It's literature, but it was just written by brilliant men, just like Shakespeare or anything else. It's just like any other book. Well, now you realize what you have. Even if you haven't been having a discussion with me about Scripture or religion or anything like that, now you have an opportunity to ask a question. So, I say the Bible is just like any other ancient book. It's a literary masterpiece, but it's written by men. So what is your first action as we start this conversation?
What do you mean by that?
Okay? What do you mean by that? So I might say, well, I think that people sometimes they tend to exalt the Bible higher than it needs to be. I mean, it's no different from any other ancient book. I don't understand why people make such a big deal of it. It has problems and contradictions and so forth, just like anything else. So now what do you do?
How did you come to the conclusion that it has contradictions?
Well, that's common knowledge. I mean, there are things in the Bible that talk about the earth being flat. There's things in the Bible that contradict each other in terms of the history. There are whole groups of people in the Bible that are talked about that are never been found by archaeologists. Just all sorts of things.
Have you studied the Bible?
Very good. You notice what Anne just worked into the conversation? What did I say at the beginning? I never really read the Bible. I didn't find it particularly important because I thought people blew it out of proportion. So now I'm saying all these things, making all these claims about Scripture, and Anne very accurately pointed out, wait, did you say that you hadn't read the Bible? How do you know all these things, right? Which means what? To kind of take a pause on the conversation. If I haven't read the Bible for myself, but I'm saying all these things about the Bible, where am I getting that information? From other people. So, okay, if you haven't read the Bible, right. So, let's go down the path. Remember, this conversation can go a whole lot of different ways depending on both the questions and the answers. So let's go down Anne's path for just a second. If I've just exposed that I'm relying on other people, what might the next question be?
Would this be a good time to say
It might be, but I think that we can leave a rock in their shoe before we make that attempt. So, yes, that's what we're moving towards in this scenario. But if we've established, as Ann and Byron have both pointed out for us, that I am relying on other people and what they think about the Bible, let's go off of the second question, I believe Liz asked it earlier. She said, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, I just told you, without actually telling you, I've come to that conclusion because I've been reading what a bunch of people say about the Bible, apparently. So now we can get more specific. So, for example, you could ask, well, I would be really interested in learning about some of the things that you've been reading. Maybe could you share with me some of these things you've been reading that make these claims about the Bible? Because I'm not aware of these things you're saying are true about the Bible. I've never heard that those things are true. So I would love to study more about that. Now, what have I just done? Very good. So, going back to the conversation, if I get asked that question, do I feel attacked? If y'all ask me in this conversation, you ask me, could you show me what you've been reading? Do I feel attacked at that point? I shouldn't, right? There's nothing about that that's confrontational. And yet, as Liz pointed out for us, what just happened? I am now having to prove myself. Now, from my perspective, I feel like I might be able to convince you of my point of view, but you are actually setting me up because you are going to have more resources now to say, okay, well, let's work through this and see where the flaws are in the arguments that you've heard. Now, if that's the direction we go, that might be the end of the discussion. In which case, it might be could you share those with me? And I say, sure, I'll share them with you. And then, okay, could I have some time to look at them? And then we can have another discussion, right? Because I need time to look at them. I can't just read them all right there. I'm not a speed reader. I'm a speed listener sometimes on Audible, but I'm not a speed reader. So, we need time at that point. Let's rewind a little bit, though. Let's say that that's not the direction that we go with this idea. So let's back up to about where Anne had brought up that discrepancy. So we have the Bible just like any other ancient book. Why do you think that? Well, there's all these contradictions, all these kind of things. So then, let's say that I have made this statement, it's a literary masterpiece, so forth and so on. And then I say this, I say, well, nothing in it is different from any other book. Where do we go from there? If we don't go the direction of you haven't actually read the Bible, so why don't you tell us who you're actually reading instead, right? What question can we ask from there? Okay, good. So always be willing, thank you for saying that, always be willing to go back to question 1 or question 2 as needed throughout the conversation. So, I've made some statements, but now I've made another statement that you want more clarification on. Remember, a big part of this is gathering information. So I say, well, for example, a lot of people who read the Bible, they take all these stories literally. Stories about someone being swallowed by a fish. Stories about someone, raising an axe head and having it float on the water. By the way, if they say something like that, they probably have read more of the Bible than they're letting on, because that's kind of a vague one. But they throw out miracles, right? All these different miracles, they take all those things literally. Those are meant to be stories that prove a point. They're not meant to be taken literally. They're like myths, like Aesop's fables or something. They're good. They prove a point, but they don't actually they aren't meant to be taken literally. Now what? Okay. That stuff just doesn't happen. I don't really know how else to say it. That just doesn't happen. Okay, good. But remember, we want to answer a question with a question. You're right. But see, that's why I want to practice. That's what I want to say, right? There's a lot of things we want to be like, oh, hold on, you're wrong, come on, right? But I just said there are supernatural things in the Bible that people take literally. You've asked how I come to a conclusion. I'm like, well, we never see it happen. Nothing like that ever happens. You see what I've just done? If I say I know that the things in the Bible didn't happen because we never see anything like happening today, I'm saying that unless I see it today, it doesn't happen. So where do we go from there?
Well, what I want to say may not be right, but it makes me want to maybe ask a little bit, what about things that we read about in history or
Very good.
something in that vein?
Okay, very good. We can do that in two ways, right? We can be very snarky about it, and I'm not saying you want to be snarky, but my tendency sometimes would be to be snarky about it. I'm like, oh, so if you didn't see it happen, it didn't happen, right? That's not the way we want to approach it, but we do want to expose that flaw. So, for example, well, do you believe that, I don't know, let's say, do you believe that Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried an entire city? Well, sure I do. Well, we don't really see a lot of things like that happening in the modern day to that scale, or Mount St. Helens or something like that. Or maybe we could pick a different one. What about the battle that happened in, now I'm going down the history route, but what about the giant battles that used to happen in ancient Roman history? Well, do you believe those happened? Well, sure I do. Well, we don't see them, right? They don't happen now in the same way. We have completely different stuff. Why aren't those just myths? Why aren't all of those histories just myths? The idea being, and I'm not coming up with a great illustration right now, but the idea being, take them to something that doesn't happen anymore and see if they believe it. Because there's a whole lot of things that have happened in history that don't still happen, at least not in the same way, but everyone believes that they still happen, or that they happened at one time. Or we could go another direction. This is the C.S. Lewis approach in this case. He wrote a whole book on this. So he's saying, or I'm saying in this scenario, miracles don't happen. Supernatural things don't happen. If I say supernatural things don't happen, what does that mean? There is a whole universe. How would I know that supernatural things don't happen? Ultimately, the only way I can say for certain supernatural things do not happen is if I know everything and nothing is supernatural, right? So, let's say that I ask, or let's say that I say that, you could ask something like, well, do you think there are things that have happened that you've just never seen happen before? Or have you seen some of every type of thing that happens? Or you could even go a different route. Now, this is depending on the person you're talking to. We'll move on to the next one in a second because now we're getting more and more into the weeds. Or you could go the direction of, well, do you believe that the universe had a beginning? Now, they might say, well, yes, scientifically we've proven that there was a Big Bang, all that kind of stuff. This will usually get them if you go this direction as far as something that they have to see to believe. Well, that doesn't happen today. Big Bangs don't happen around the universe, right? You're not even going to try and address whether or not the Big Bang actually happened. That's not, who cares about that right now? You're showing they believe in something that supposedly happened in the past that doesn't happen today. That, by the way, would by definition be a supernatural event because it is the origin of nature in their minds. Okay, let's move on to another one. You believe whatever you want, but you Christians have no right to force your morals on other people. Let's say you and I are having a conversation, and you mention that you are thankful that some person in some higher office is implementing laws to, let's say, limit abortion or something like that. Okay? Now, we're not going to address abortion specifically in this particular prompt. The person responds, not attacking your stance on abortion specifically, but just generally saying, you know what, I don't have a problem if you oppose things like abortion, but you Christians have no right to force your morals on other people. By the way, you're going to hear this argument a lot over the next few months, specifically as it relates to abortion. What do you say? I've made that statement.
you think it's right to pay taxes?
Ooh, okay, so we're going to cut right there. Do I think it's right to pay taxes? Well, of course.
Why do you believe that?
Well, because that's what the government tells us to do, and we need to support the ordering of society.
What if you don't like that?
Well, it doesn't matter if I like that. That's the right thing to do.
Aren't they forcing you to do that?
Very good. Very good. You see what Ralph has just done here. It's an excellent example. Ralph has taken what seems to be a completely unrelated thing, and he's pointed out, well, I have no problem with some things being forced on me. So it's not that I have a problem with things being forced on me, it's what things are being forced on me. So maybe I respond to that once I see where you're going, right? I'm like, oh, you're trying to trick me, you little tricky whatever. And so I say, okay, but those aren't the same thing. Taxes, that's just a practical necessity. We're talking about morals here. We shouldn't be forcing morals on other people. We shouldn't be using government, especially, to force morals on other people. Now what do we say?
This world won't survive without morals. We have to have, to some degree, of morals for us to get along.
Okay, good. So how would we put that in the form of a question? Because remember, you always want to keep me having to answer the question. What are some morals we need so that the world doesn't fall apart, besides something like abortion?
Do you believe that murder is wrong?
Ah, very good. And make sure, in a scenario like this, do you believe that adults murdering adults is wrong, right? Because they might think, well, but abortion isn't murder. No, that's not what I'm saying. Do you believe murder is inherently wrong? Well, of course. So then where do you go with that? Why is murder wrong, right? Connect murder with what? What did you say, Bunny? Without morals, the world falls apart? Well, what is murder? Murder is something that everyone recognizes to be immoral. So, I've just said, well, yes, we need to make sure that murder doesn't happen, obviously. So what do you say? What do you ask?
Aren't you forcing your moral on me?
Well, maybe I don't agree with you, right? I'm being you for a second. Maybe I don't agree with you that murder should be immoral. Maybe I want to murder someone. Man, they really got under my skin, right? So, you're forcing your opinion on me. Very good. Now what do I have to do? Now we're back to me being the devil's advocate. Now what do I have to do? I either have to somehow make a case that murder is not a moral argument, which is silly, or I have to try and make a difference between Christian morals and morals that everyone accepts. So maybe this is where I go. Well, everyone agrees that murder is wrong, but not everyone agrees that abortion is murder. So we need to only stick with forcing beliefs that everyone agrees are wrong. Oh, do you see what we just did? How many people in Nazi Germany believed that killing Jews was wrong? Certainly not the majority, right? So, without being snarky about it, what might you ask me?
You could ask, where does law
Okay, good.
come? The majority of people believe, or is there a true right or wrong?
Good. And then I'm forced to either say there's a true right or wrong, in which case I go back to, well then, aren't we supposed to force morals on people even if the majority doesn't want it? Or I have to go the other route and say, well, it is the majority, in which case, so if the majority of Americans wanted to legalize murder, you're saying that would be the moral thing to do, would be not to force people not to murder because the majority of people want it. Oh man, you got him, right? It's so easy with an argument like this in particular. So, I'll stop there for a second before going to a third scenario. Does this make sense, what we're doing? I know it doesn't always, he talks about, and we'll talk about very soon in the next chapter, he's going to talk about practice. This is why I want us to be doing some of these kind of interactive things. Most of this process And learning how to do this process is about practice. So are we, any questions, any difficulties as we're kind of going through this what do you call it, this workshopping kind of process? Is this making sense, what we're doing here? Does this seem like something that would happen in a normal conversation? Like, can we see how this could play out in an actual conversation as opposed to just, workshopping it together like this? I can see the mindset.
Well, do you remember the Muslim Shibble book?
Yes.
The very first verse that he gave you
Mm-hmm.
was verse 7. Thessalonians about you don't believe in the gospel. You
Very good.
Flaming fire and tribulation and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, then the next question, what is the gospel?
Very good.
And then
Very
that
good.
sequence starts.
Yeah.
But he never told me what it was. He just gave me the verse.
Yes. He continued to ask him questions related to, well, could you help me understand what this means based on what you said, kind of thing. Very, very good. That I like, one of the things I like about that book, most people are familiar with it by now, but if you haven't read it, give it a read. One of the things I like about that book, it was a real conversation. Like, this was a real back and forth exchange. This was not, something that somebody made up as a scenario, which is kind of what we're having to do. This is a very real situation, a very real conversation. Let's go ahead and ask one more question, or workshop one more question, and then we'll move on. This one's a tough one, and we might address this maybe even in more detail later, because we won't have time to go through all the different ways we could do it tonight. If God did exist, let's say someone is trying to, or you are trying to be comforting to me. I've just lost someone important to me. And you say something related to, I don't know, something about I'll be praying for you or something like that. And that kind of ticks me off because I don't believe in God. If God did exist, I say, if he really was all-powerful and all-loving, he would not allow evil things to happen to innocent people. Now, given the parameters of what I've just said, the scenario, what might you respond with?
We probably wouldn't have that conversation right then.
Good. There are times where it might not be appropriate to go down this road. If someone is struggling, maybe the scenario here is just to show them love. If you need anything, we're right there. Put together something to show them that you care. Try and stay in really good contact with them. Why? If they are expressing this kind of sentiment, two things might be the case. Number one, is it easy to say things you don't mean when you're undergoing extreme grief? Yeah. They may not even mean what they've said. If they do, however, if this is sincerely their belief, which it very well may be, what is it going to tell them if someone who believes in something that they think is ridiculous shows them an exceptional amount of love, even after you've insulted their faith? You might tell them there's something different about this person. And you've created more of an in without confronting this on the front end that you can then come back to. So I agree. I did not plant that answer, but I agree 100% with Liz. In that scenario, it might not be the time to use our tactics. It might be the time to further build a connection in a relationship and then come back to this. And maybe even later on, using questions. You said something to me a while back that I was curious if you could help me understand better. You said that if God was all-powerful and he was all-loving, then he wouldn't allow evil things to happen to innocent people. Could you help me understand what you mean by that? Now, you see what I've just done? I've taken something they said way long ago, restarted the conversation with question number one. Could you help me understand what you mean by that? So, the answer might be, well, those two things just don't work. If he's all-powerful and all-loving, he would eradicate evil and no evil things would happen to innocent people. So where do we go from there?
What do you mean by innocent?
People that don't deserve the kind of awful things. I mean, a child doesn't deserve cancer. They probably cut straight to something like that. Now where do we go? This is why we practice, by the way, because this is one of the hardest scenarios you're ever going to encounter.
Well, I was just thinking, but miracles don't exist now
Mm-hmm.
in our time.
Mm-hmm.
That was in God's time.
Good.
That be
That's true,
the wrong thing to say, though.
but they don't believe in miracles either way.
Oh, that's right.
So we know that. That's one of those things we have in our minds. I can't go that direction. And so we have to kind of piece together the puzzle from their perspective. So good observation. What else? Let's just pause the conversation for a second. What's the problem with this logic in general? Is this a sound argument? If God was all powerful and if God was all loving, he wouldn't allow evil things to happen to innocent people. Is that correct? Is that statement correct?
That God, how do you know it's evil?
Ah, okay. Very good. That's one very good way to go through this. Now, that's not going to be a satisfactory line of questioning to stay in, but that's going to take it, number one, away from the emotional charge that it might go if you go down a different path, and it's also going to be something they may not expect. So that goes back kind of and connects with what Liz asked earlier. What do you mean by innocent people? Or what do you mean by evil? Well, neither of those words mean anything if there's not a standard. And where can a standard come from if not from God? So you might ask a question then of something like, what do you mean by evil? Just ask that. And they say, well, bad things happening to people. Well, how do we know that that's an evil? Or is it just something we don't like? And then we kind of keep on going down that line of questioning. Again, we might save this one and go into even more detail next time because we're about out of time. But we see what we're trying to do here. We're trying to ask questions. We're trying to recognize directions of questioning or conversation that aren't going to be helpful. But we're also trying to continue to gather information. Here's another way we could go along with this. We could say, what do you mean by all-powerful? Or what do you mean by all-loving? And they kind of explain, perhaps. And then you might say, well, let me ask you something. If you allow your innocent child to, do something that causes them a tiny bit of pain so they learn not to do it again. I don't know, you get a stove just hot enough to where it stings but it doesn't actually burn or something like that. I don't know. Teach them not to touch a hot stove. Well, aren't you allowing an evil thing to happen to an innocent person? Now in the scenario, what do they have to do? Either it's not evil, it's just unpleasant, or either they're not innocent, they did something wrong. In which case, you can go one of two ways. Either, well, but isn't that true of most people that they're not really innocent by that definition? Now, the children would have to talk about in a different scenario. Or, we could say with the evil, well, but then how do we know that's truly evil? Because maybe God allows something that we find to be unpleasant, but it's for a greater purpose. Again, way too much to cover in just our scenario. I'm just giving some directions we could go. Any thoughts on that before we wrap up, though? Again, we're going to continue doing some of this workshopping thing as we wrap up this first part, and then please give me some feedback, as I mentioned at the beginning, on what your thoughts are as far as going to the second part or taking a pause or whatever. But any last thoughts on kind of what we've done so far tonight? All right, well, I hope this has been helpful. Feedback is extremely helpful, especially with these kind of things, so please let me know what we can do to kind of make this more helpful, more realistic. Wrapping up, though, I want to mention something that he says here. I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. The author points out this passage. He says, be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. That's what we're trying to do with these kind of tactics. As we workshop these kind of things especially, we're trying to be very, very wise in how we are encountering, how we are structuring our conversation. But we also want to be harmless. Another translation sometimes says innocent. We aren't trying to cause unnecessary conflict. We aren't trying in any way to insult. We are trying, ultimately, to create open doors for further conversation. Just because question 3 is ultimately actively trying to make a point, I'm not on the defensive at this point, I'm on the offensive, that doesn't give me an excuse to offend. I can be on the offensive without being offensive. And that's important for us to remember here. We'll talk about this more, though, as we move forward. Just remember, not every interaction is going to go like you want it. That's why we're workshopping these things. The more we practice, the better we'll be equipped to handle these kinds of situations. As always, the Lord's invitation is open. If there is anything we can do to encourage you, to help you tonight, we encourage you to let us know as we stand and sing.
'Tis so sweet
To trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word.